Matthew Phelps, co-author of the Turning to God's Word Bible study, You Shall Have No Other Gods, the book of Exodus. Today we'll be talking about lesson 14 of our study, which covers the book of Exodus, chapters 16 and 17. There's a lot going on here. In the previous lesson, we saw we're dealing somewhat with these people's basic needs, right? We saw they made it out of Egypt. First, they didn't have any water. There was a whole deal about that. It got sorted. We're good to go now. And the ground rules were laid around, if you're going to be the people of God, then you need to act like it. They got a pass for that first time. Then, here, now, not long after, we hit the same issue around food. And so we're going to visit the issue of food, and God's going to get so exacerbated, he's going to say, really, this is what you're so concerned about? This is so easy for me, I can literally make bread fall from the sky. So food, you're focused on the wrong things, right? And then not long after, they go right back to the water thing, right? But they had a conversation about this one already with God. That was the one where they got a pass the first time, and now it's a bigger deal if it comes up again because they've talked about this, and then they just did the food thing. We're starting to see a pattern, right? If the people were so inclined to learn to trust God, they would be trusting God. And instead, they are not. So that we'll go through some of how that develops in a lot more detail. There's quite a bit of text in this lesson and a lot of interesting things that happen. But that becomes a bit of a sticking point, I will say, in anticipation. And then finally, there's also the first military conquest by these people that involves, God definitely takes a very, pardon the pun, an active hand in how this works. And again, all of these things are here to demonstrate God's overwhelming power, right? You're thirsty, God makes water. You're hungry, God makes food. You have to fight people. As long as you're doing things to entreat God, you can win. There is no reason these people shouldn't have faith in God, except they just can't take that step. And God is being reasonably patient under the circumstances. But the things God is interested in doing for the people aren't just seeing to their material needs. And that's where I think there's a lesson here for us, right? What are the things that we ask God for and the things we're concerned when we're not getting, right? Oh God, I could really use a pony is not a very helpful prayer to anyone, right? God doesn't want to give me a pony. He wants to give me eternal life and happiness and a loving relationship with him. If he thinks a pony might be what gets me to that, then he would give me a pony, but that's stupid, right? There's no way that the one follows from the other. But in less ridiculous examples that don't involve ponies in any way, we do this, right? We do this constantly. We focus on the things we feel that we need to live and to have a comfortable and a fulfilled life, and we evaluate our relationship with God on the basis of whether he's providing those things. And if he's not, then we judge God as coming up short, which is ludicrous, but it's a thing that we do. Maybe not all of it, it's a thing that I do. And it's so inappropriate because it's a misunderstanding on our part of what God is trying to do for us. And we're selling ourselves so short when we focus on those little things that God could do easily and miss the big things that he's trying to do that are less easy and more worth doing. So that's the real takeaway here as we look at where these people are coming up short is, are we doing the same thing? Because it's definitely how I see most people these days talk about relating to God. And initially started learning to do it myself because it's what I saw people doing. And I thought that's how you were, how your relationship with God was supposed to work. And it's just not. Is what are we seeking from God and what are we doing about it? Do we think he'll let us starve to death? No. So we're probably going to be okay. And if he does, well, if you have eternal beatitude with God afterwards, does it matter? All of these peripheral things that we see as the most important things to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, right? The foundation upon which this country was built. Those are the things that don't matter to God. And that we tend to ascribe a great amount of importance to ourselves. The things that do matter to God, those are the ones we should be seeking. And I will suggest to anyone watching this, if you want your life to radically change, do that. Try to instead focus on the things that God wants for you instead of the things you want for yourself. And you will find yourself going in a very different direction. And it will be a surprising and a very fulfilling one. And you'll pretty quickly get past worrying about, God, I don't have anything to eat right now, and get to, wow, this is cool. But it's hard to make that shift. So that's our challenge here, and we're going to see, as they do for us so often, the Israelites demonstrate that by failing at it. So everyone gets together and says, Moses, really, you brought us out to the wilderness and we're going to die of hunger. When we were in Egypt, we were horribly oppressed, but we weren't dying of hunger. Maybe that was better. Just saying, we weren't hungry when we were slaves. What a thankless and ignorant approach, right? They saw what God did to free them from slavery. It wasn't quite literally moving heaven and earth, but it was as big of a deal with the parting of the waters of the sea, not to mention the slaughter of the firstborn and all the other plagues. They witnessed all of that and what it took to get them free. And now they're saying, it wasn't so bad, just because they're a little hungry. That has to be so exacerbating for Moses. And that's where something comes up here that I had never really looked at this way before, but I think it's fitting and appropriate and funny, to me at least, is Moses is so exacerbated by this. He says, really, food is what you're so concerned about? That is so easy for God. I will literally make food fall from the sky for you. That's how small of a deal it should be to worry about getting food when God is your God. Okay, there's no food around, we're in the desert. Great. It'll just fall from the sky and you can eat it. You guys are focusing on the wrong thing. This is so trivially easy for God that it just is there. That's incredible, right? The miracle of manna in the wilderness is that's not how people get food, right? In case there's any misunderstanding here, that people think somehow in the ancient world it used to rain food, and that's a thing that happened. That's not a thing that happened. That's not a thing that happens. That's a unique thing that happens here. And it's meant to highlight how truly ridiculous it is to be concerned about whether God can provide food and how easy it is for him to do so. It's such a non-issue for God. It can just, if you want some food, just fall from the sky. There's your food. Now, can we move on to, again, the important things? Where this gets really interesting is this almost rash facility of providing in such overwhelming and abundance and ease is the image that Jesus uses to talk about the grace of eternal life, right? Like, again, like you all are so concerned about what? Like, I'm the bread from heaven, right? I'm that thing that's so easy for God to provide. You're worried about life and death. Like, it falls from the sky. But it's me. And it's here, and it's easy for you. And what are you all doing about it? Because it was people still complaining, Jesus, we came out and followed you out into the wilderness, and we're hungry now, and that's your problem. I came and I didn't pack enough food, and I followed you, and my hunger is now your problem. Because I don't want to deal with it. And Jesus is again exacerbated, and this is so easy. Like, you want something like what happened before, you're missing what's in front of you, right? The thing that this really means and does, and the thing God was trying to point your ancestors toward when all they could think about was food and water, is still the thing I'm trying to point you toward, and now I am here, and I am it, and you're still worried about being hungry, you dumb people. What are you doing? The connection is very on purpose, and this isn't a study of the gospel according to John, so we won't get into that in more detail, but it's in the 6th chapter if you would like to check that out. It's a very intentional repetition of the motif here with a change in the form of Jesus. But here, the point is, like, this idea of food coming down from heaven is meant to be, like, ridiculous in terms of what it is and highlight just how easy this is for God, right? Like, and again, the people don't have to do anything, right? It's the same as with conquering the Egyptians, right? Like, you don't have to, I'll just fight for you. You don't have to fight. Oh, you're going to be hungry. The food will just fall down. All you have to do is go collect it. You don't have to plant crops. You don't have to go hunting. You don't have to raise livestock. All you have to do is go out and grab it. It's just going to fall down from the sky for you. Why are you people worried about taking care of your needs? God will see to it for them. He does an interesting thing with it, which is he puts a limit on it. He's going to provide, but he's only going to provide for the day at hand and not into the future. If we're going to do this, we're going to do it in a way that teaches you to trust God. You have enough for today, and on the Sabbath, the day before the Sabbath, you have enough for 2 days. And that's all you are meant to take. And that's the arrangement. If you can trust God, then he will provide your needs one day at a time. He's not trying to make these people rich, and he's not trying to get them to a place where they can see their needs fulfilled in a long time, right? This thing is about learning to trust God. And so they are deliberately not always having in a place where there's an overabundance of water, in a place where there's an overabundance of food. They are deliberately in a place where those resources that are trivially easy for God to provide, they have no way to obtain for themselves otherwise. And what they're meant to be learning is to rely on, to trust God, and to do it graciously. What they're instead learning or demonstrating is a lot of complaining. But this has been designed by God and Moses in a way that's meant to be teaching them, inviting them to faith and to trust in God. And that's one that also matters to us, right? If you're thinking those areas where we have needs in our lives that are not met, those material things that aren't really the business of the thing we should be talking to God most about all the time, are still there so that we can trust God, right? Like, if we get too comfortable and too content, it is pretty hard to rely on God. And so those things where we don't have everything we would need or want are great areas for us to grow in faith. So much so that we hold up as models and as saints some people who have had their needs met and have said no, and have turned instead to reliance on God. St. Francis of Assisi is one of the famous examples, right? He grew up a rich kid and he said, this isn't, like, the demands of his position and wealth were conflicting with how he wanted to serve God. And he said, yeah, no, I don't need any of this stuff. I just need God. So I'm going to go do that. Bye, Dad. Here you can have these fancy clothes. I'm out. That sort of attitude is a step beyond what we're seeing here, right? That's the one that says, not only should we not be obsessing about, in our relationship with God, about Him making sure we're taken care of materially, but at some point, if we get too taken care of, it can be harmful to our relationship with God. And maybe we need to look for ways to be less comfortable in order that we can really be relying on God. Here, in this example, in the book of Exodus, God is forcing that upon these people because they would never choose it. But we do hold up as models of great holiness people who have chosen that. In the very early days of the church, it was not at all uncommon for people to go live out in the desert. Right? This is out in the desert. The Israelites are out in the desert against their will, and they hate it. People later, after Jesus, said, I want to go do that, and to be that reliant on God, and to gain from the desert the thing He was trying to give to our distant ancestors. I'm going to go try to find the thing that He said was out there that they failed to find. So I'm going to go live out in the desert. And that eventually became, I'm going to live in a monastery. We still do a form of choosing this that is formalized and involves vows to God, and develops some of that reliance, dependence on God. There are still ways to do this deliberately today in a structured community with other people choosing to do the same thing. Catholic monasticism is amazing, and more people should be familiar with it as a viable option for anyone wanting to live a holy life. That's the point. It's a good way to do that. And that it is basically by choice doing what here the Israelites are rebelling against. God was trying to show them something essential about who He is out in the wilderness, and they kept rebelling. And we have people who instead choose to go back out there to find what they missed. For those of us not in a position where we feel like we can just give away all of our possessions and go into a monastery or anything. I'm not saying you have to do that to be holy, right? There's a good middle ground. And St. Paul is a good model of that, right? I'm okay whether I'm rich or poor because I rely on God either way, right? You can be detachment from things of the world is the point. If you tend to overly attach, it can be helpful to create some detachment. But if your relationship with God is the right way, then you probably don't care if you're rich or poor, right? And then you can be rich without doing egregious harm to your soul. But if you are someone who couldn't just as easily give it all away, then you shouldn't have it. And that's not just money, although money becomes like the primary representation of that, right? It's comfort in general, right? If you get too used to, too comfortable in a state in your life such that you can't see being okay without it, and the thing that you're attached to isn't God, then you have a problem. Because you have something that is interfering with your relationship with God. Here for the Israelites, it's this idea that which is, I mean, it's an understandable one, but it's this idea that they should be able to have their needs met and guarantee, like, for a long time to come without any external intervention, that they will continue to be so, without needing to rely on God at all. And God's point is very much, no, you don't need that security. You need to eat, you need to drink. You don't need security in food or water, because you have security in God. And that's enough. So here, in case we had missed the key point, Moses emphasizes it, right? People have been complaining to Moses and Aaron, which Moses points out in case there's any confusion. Of course, if you complain about me, you're complaining about God, because and you're whining to God and not to me, which they probably kind of knew, but Moses makes it like super clear. You can't be against the plan Moses has here without being against God, because he's the representative of God. And for right now, Aaron's being included in that too, although that gets a little iffy. But for now, that still counts. So twice a day, you've got this problem. So twice a day, you're going to be dependent on God and you're going to be reminded of it. I didn't really emphasize in the previous question. I probably should have. There's manna and there are quail, right? You've got bread and you've got meat at different times of day. It ends up, the point is the same though. The quail also just fall out of the sky. But so twice a day, God is going to feed you. But not in advance. So twice a day, you're reminded of your dependence upon God. And that is incredibly intentional. And that's the rule too, which will come up here shortly, is like, that's the structure. So you need to make sure you're just taking a day's worth is also there in the rule. And what use is there complaining when you have what you're after every day? Really, are you so concerned about this when it's always taken care of? So Moses has Aaron announce this is the plan. They gather everybody together. They say, don't worry, God's got this covered. Here's the plan. And you're going to have food for as long as we're here in the wilderness, and it's just going to fall out of the sky. So can we move on and talk about something more important? But here it is. You're not going to be familiar with this food, so here's what to do with it. And, we see as a part of this God. God's presence is known as a part of this, which is the part that's important, right? What is not important? The manner with which the people are fed. What is important? God is the one that is doing this. And so every time you see this happen, you should know that it's being provided by God, and that it's a sign of the glory of God. Twice a day, you mark the presence and the blessing of God. This itself becomes, in a sense, a liturgical thing, right? A daily one. We've had a day of rest for God on the seventh day. We've had a particular annual feast. Now we are having a daily, twice a day, calling to mind of the presence and the things that God are doing. We do this still too, right? Clergy are obliged to say, and lay people are invited to say, the divine office, especially the part that's obliged is morning and evening prayers. This praising and glorying and acknowledging our dependence upon God in the morning and in the evening. This is a thing we're still supposed to do. If food was used as a means of laying the foundation for it, but the whole point is the food is superfluous to the idea, and the part that matters is what you're doing for God. So this lays a new liturgical foundation that all of these liturgical things, they never go away, right? From the Sabbath and from the seventh day that there was creation to the feast of the Passover to this morning and evening praise, these things never go away. Once they're instituted, they are forever, and we still do them, and we should still do them. So I know not a lot of Catholics say, or anybody say the office or stop and give praise to God in the morning and the evening, but we should, and we can, and it's not that hard. There are apps that you can download that will guide you through it. It's not anywhere near as hard as it was before the internet, when you had to have books with ribbons, and you had to, it used to be not that, it used to be overwhelming, even if it wasn't that hard once you knew how it worked. And again, this is a monastic thing. So one of the things that generally, I come from a Benedictine tradition and background, and that's a huge deal for them. But generally, in the monastic tradition, they say the whole office, and these prayers are a thing that they do. So out in the wilderness, this becoming a thing that becomes a practice. It's not surprising that it is still a part of our monastic tradition, built on the idea of being out in the wilderness with God. But it's a thing we're all invited to do. And all of these liturgical things that God is putting in place for his people are things we should be doing if we want to build a relationship with God. That's why he's establishing them. So this becomes, the food becomes entirely beside the point here, but the thing that it cultivates, the habit it creates of turning to and acknowledging the presence and dependence upon God twice a day, that is the thing we should take with us. So the rules are clear. Twice a day, there's going to be food. Take what you need. Here's a specific amount you're allowed to take. That's how much you take. You don't take more. You don't try to save it. You just take that much, and then tomorrow it will be there again. And then the next day, and then the next day. And every day you take the amount you need for the day. Give us this day our daily bread, not our monthly bread. But that is a concept these people struggle with. They immediately decide to start trying to hoard this. We'll see that, it melts, right? It's designed in a way, this miraculous bread from heaven, that they can't do that. It doesn't keep. So God is ahead of them on this one, and it doesn't keep. Likewise, for us, I mentioned the prayers are the important part of this, right? So one thing to note is if you're you can't make up lost days, right? If you're trying to pray the office, and you miss a day, don't try to make it up, right? But if you're trying to cultivate that attitude of praise of God in the morning and the evening, and you don't do it sometime, that can never be made up, right? You don't get to go back and fill it in. Just do it again when you can. But if it's a thing you're trying to do, it really needs to be daily. And because it's that reflection of your utter reliance on God to get through the day. And so if you miss it, ideally, you should feel like you don't have what it takes to get through the day. That obviously takes time and cultivation. And you can't bank that, right? You can't bank that relationship with God any more than you can bank the manna that goes away. You have to put the work in every day. You can't get ahead, and you can't make up when you're behind. Every day you have to put in the work. And again, that's what God's trying to teach, right? He doesn't care about manna. He doesn't care about whether it keeps or not, and that the people only get enough food for any given day, right? He doesn't care at all about that, right? If these people were less stubborn, I bet that the food would keep, right? If they'd be willing to, otherwise show devotion to him all the time, and he didn't have to try to teach them through this thing they need, then I'm sure the manna could keep and God wouldn't care at all, right? The point here is what he's teaching them, and what he's suggesting to us via what he's teaching to them. And that's that you have to do it every day. And you should be dependent upon and relying on God every day. And that relationship doesn't happen if you're not regular with it. And you can't pre-build enough relationship with God to get you through a month, and you can't miss a month and then scramble to, but God, now I really need something, so I'm going to try to make up for all the time that I wasn't building a relationship. It's necessary for every day. So there's one exception to this structure that is also something that persists, which is liturgy is ranked in importance, right? So more important than this twice daily dependence on God is the idea of the Sabbath, which is supposed to be a whole day dedicated. You're already doing a morning and evening thing if you're doing the whole day, right? So the morning and the evening part is subsumed into the celebration of the Sabbath. So from a liturgical point of view, you don't need to do that. From a practical point of view, you're not supposed to do work on the Sabbath, so you better not be going out gathering manna. So one day a week, the sixth day, you can gather twice as much as you need, so you have enough for the Sabbath as well. And it won't fall on the Sabbath, and you won't gather it. And only on the sixth day will the food keep, and will it be still available on the next day. So that is training the idea that the Sabbath is more important than these twice daily observations, right? We still rank feasts as well, right? All over the place, there's this idea. If you're supposed to have the 20th Sunday of ordinary time, but instead it's, the Transfiguration some big feast, right? Or the Assumption. Then on that Sunday, you would celebrate the Assumption, because in terms of ranking of feasts, it's more important. Or more easily, if it's supposed to be the Wednesday in the third week of ordinary time, and instead it's the Feast of Whoever, then the Feast of Whoever outranks the normal day in ordinary time, so you have that, right? You do one thing at a time liturgically, right? You don't try to cram together these multiple things and make some hybrid version that doesn't do a good job doing any of them, right? One thing at a time is what you're doing, and it's ranked, and you do the highest ranking one first. So if it is the Sabbath, then that outranks these daily collections of food, so you do the Sabbath. And that's the concept, and that still matters as well for us, right? I think where I see this most and have done this most is in our prayer lives, right? Like people take like a scatter shot, throw everything they can think of against the wall to see what sticks, sort of approach to praying. When we're praying, you have your one thing that is the most important thing, right? Whatever highest ranking thing, that's the thing you should be focusing on. You don't make more progress praying by adding in more things. You make more progress by doing the thing you deem most important better. Okay, you could still have your morning and evening things in your Sabbath. How does that make your observance of the Sabbath better? It doesn't. The way you make your observance of the Sabbath better is by doing it better, not by doing additional things on top of it. I think we easily can fall into this approach of, I'm just going to load up more stuff, and eventually I'll get enough stuff loaded up that I'll be holy. When you could make much more progress, likely, with one thing done very well than with 10 things done badly. You definitely could. Now, I'm not saying you couldn't do 2 or 3 things very well. I'm not saying just do, if you're looking for a place to start and a next step, instead of trying to do a bunch of things, pick one. And try to do it very consistently and very well, and keep some kind of idea of ranking of the things that you're doing, and make sure the higher and more important things stay that way. Once that's established, you can add something else and try something else, but then make sure everything stays in its proper place, right? And you'll make a lot more progress than this approach where we very well-meaningly try to add a whole lot of things and don't do any of them very well. After a part there was quite a bit to unpack. This one's pretty straightforward. You should keep some of this in perpetuity as a reminder of what happened, especially since it doesn't naturally occur and will never happen again once it's done. So you keep and are able to keep forever this sample, this reminder of what it was that God did. There's an interesting thing here in verse 34. Aaron placed it before the covenant to be kept. That is where it ends up. That's getting ahead of us a little bit because we don't have it goes in the ark that we don't have yet, with the staff of Aaron, which we have but is still being used, and the tablets of the law, which we don't have yet. So that's getting ahead of us a little bit, and it's also pointing out, this keeps falling down from the sky for the 40 years the people are in the wilderness. They keep it. So although the ark was lost, so we can't go see this unless it's in Ethiopia, was used by Indiana Jones to kill Nazis. For all practical purposes, the ark is lost, whether it really is or not. It functionally is. And from a higher level and theological point of view, it's good that it is, because that's been replaced, right? We can see the bread come down from heaven in an imitation of, it's not an imitation, it's a better version, fulfillment in part of the Ark of the Covenant in every Catholic church in the world. There is bread from heaven in the form of bread kept in the tabernacle, which is the form of the ark. So this, again, is a thing that has still occurred and that we still have access to a form of today. And the form that we have now, this isn't a thing we should be sorry that it was lost, right? The form we have now is better than the one that they had. Insofar as Jesus is better than bread, which is really far. much better thing that we have available, which raises another interesting point of reflection. Because if the ark showed up and you could travel and you could see it, a lot of people would want to go who have no interest in showing up at church and regularly and looking at the better one, and praying with and spending time with the better one. I'll just leave that point hanging. You can make of it what you will. But it is an interesting thing to consider. So here, then, we are repeating what just happened. The food is taken care of. Now the people again are thirsty. And now they are complaining to Moses. And they're echoing that familiar refrain, why did we come out here to die? We were fine and we weren't dying of thirst in Egypt. Was it really so bad? Why, Moses, why did you do this to us? Remember, we just went through this and they got a pass. And now it's coming right back. They're not learning the lessons yet, right? Which again, if you're thirsty, I can get, but they're not catching on very fast. Let's see what happens this time. So, Moses is concerned for his safety at this point, with the attitude. In case you think this is just like a little bit of grumbling and whining and complaining, it is to the extent that Moses is worried about his safety. The people are really discontent. And so God gives Moses a thing to do about it. So take the magic staff, which of course has no inherent powers, other than God just decides that that's a thing that he's going to have them use to do stuff with. And strike a rock, and water will come out of it. And so that is what happens. In the text here, this seems like that appeases the people and all is well, and it's no big deal. But this comes back up in the Psalms and shows us a little bit more about the attitude of the people here and God's view of it, right? This is the previous iteration of God providing water for the people who were thirsty, also referenced a test. That time, they were not put to the test. They were provided with water and then said, cool, here's a test. So now, when they're bringing it back up again, they have been put to the test. It's saying that they put the Lord to the test too, right? Fascinatingly in verse 7, right? And because they put the Lord to the test by saying, is the Lord among us or not? Which is true, but they were also being put to the test by the Lord, and they failed. God passed, they failed. Do not grow stubborn as your ancestors did in the wilderness, when at Meribah and Massah they put me to the test. There's a psalm about this. And this event is held up as an example of allowing your heart to grow hard and putting God to the test and failing in your obligation and your relationship to God. Interestingly, in the context of the divine office, this is one of the possible introductory psalms to the office for the day. At any time, whether you say vigils at overnight or early in the morning, or you start with morning prayer. If you start the divine office for the day with morning prayer, more often than not, the odds are you're going to start with a psalm that goes through this event, and entreats God not to let your heart grow hard as these people's hearts grew hard. This little bit of time in the wilderness, this is meant to be foundational for how we live our spiritual lives, right? This event, the test is still ongoing. We can still pass by not letting our hearts grow as hard like theirs did and not putting God to the test. And we have decided, the church has decided, that is the thing we should be reflecting on and beginning every day with a reminder of, is don't do this. Like, one of the key things that bookends or that frames every day we're meant to live is don't do this. So it takes a paragraph in the middle of a lot of events in the book of Exodus, and it's easy to get lost. I've looked up any number of times, because I lived at a monastery for a while. I said that psalm every morning, and I constantly forgot what the events of Meribah and Massah were, and I had to look it up a bunch of times, because it's so insignificant in the story of the scripture. It's just a little, or tiny, not insignificant, right? It's very significant, but it's just this tiny little thing that's not like some great story of tremendous accomplishments. It's deliberately and, more importantly, a daily thing, right? Like, we put disproportionate emphasis on the big deal thing, like slaying the Egyptians in the Red Sea and letting the Israelites pass through one time only. And we de-emphasize the smaller but more important daily thing of having to turn to God. And here's one of the first times the people were supposed to do it, and they failed. And then they continue to. But that daily side of it is so much more important. And so this becomes the model for how we approach every day we live our lives devoted to God, is trying not to be like these people. Now we get our first military conflict from these people. It looks like they didn't start it. Amalek approaches them and appears to be the instigator. Amalek is, by tradition, descended from Esau, Jacob's brother. So they'd be like cousins. That clearly doesn't stop the hostility. There's not a lot of explaining of the context of why Amalek is out to get them, but they are purportedly journeying toward a land that is not theirs. So with a sizable group of people, that very well, it could be nothing more than him just wanting to encourage them to go a different direction, and not really meaning any hostility beyond that. Doesn't really matter. They meet in conflict. And we introduce, or we call to mind here, somebody who will become important later, and definitely is important for the people as they look at going into the promised land and they look at having military conflicts with others, who is Joshua, who leads the people in their campaigns against, in this case Amalek, but against foreigners who would keep them out of the promised land. Where that becomes so interesting is when the Son of God comes to earth, he needs to take a name that's not the Son of God. And the name that he takes is Yeshua. And the one of those that is famous in the Bible that it must be referencing is this one. We'll see Joshua do other things other than just mowing down Amalek and his people with the edge of the sword. And those other things are probably more relevant than this one to why Jesus would take that. Joshua leads the people into the promised land, right? Moses, the law, get people to the threshold of the promised land, but are insufficient to get people into the promised land, and Moses himself is not allowed to enter. The law cannot get people to salvation, and Moses, but Joshua is the one who is able to build on what Moses started and to cross the boundary and to lead people into the promised land. That's where Jesus is really taking the name and why. But anything we see Joshua, it's worth making that reference as we're starting to see him, because he'll be more prominent. And this is kind of the first big deal thing. So beyond that, Joshua is not responsible for the military victory. He's fighting and leading the troops. And another thing is happening where Moses and Aaron and Hur go up on the top of a hill, and Moses intercedes by raising up his hands. And when his hands are raised in prayer, the Israelites are winning, but not quickly, and that is tiring. And when his hands lower, they're losing. And so the thing that people decide is, it matters, the part of this that matters, liturgy is so funny sometimes, right? The part of this that matters is not the intention of his heart or what he's doing. This part of it is actually important to the outcome. So they prop up his hands so that they can't fall down, and they win a great victory. Another thing that comes up in our culture a lot is that your heart can be in the right place and you can worship God any way you want to, and it's all the same. Do you think Moses' heart changed when his hands fell down? You think he was praying any less or intended the good of his people any less when that happened? Definitely not. Something about the form as well as the matter was important. That remains true also. There are forms in place for different ways that we worship and serve God, and they are effective because God has granted them to be effective, not because it actually matters, right? Did it matter to God if Moses' hands were up? No. Except insofar as God said, I'm going to make that matter. Because it teaches the people something again, right? Like, if Moses was just sitting there looking kind of zoned out and praying, like, nobody gets the point, right? Whereas the point is very clear that it's because of Moses' intervention. God chose to say, this is the way by which I will deliver you victory. Not because it's necessary for God, but because it was necessary for the people. He has likewise, in many other instances, told us similar things, that I will do this thing under these forms, and only will I guarantee that I will do it under these forms. It's not because his power is limited, and that if we don't specifically say, this is my body, I mind a cup, sorry, this is my body, etc. It's not like those are magic words that make bread and wine into the body and blood of Christ, and the words have any power in and of themselves, right? Because they don't. It's God acting that makes that transformation occur. But God has said, do it this way, and that's how it will work. And so that's how it works. Like the raising of the hands, it's not essential to Moses raising his hands that the people won military victories, except insofar as God says, that's how I'm going to make this work. And then that's how it works. It's not magic. Like we think of like Harry Potter, you say the right words and swish your wand the right way, and that thing creates the magic that does the spell or whatever, right? It's not at all like that. It's God just choosing to channel his power in a particular way and form for our sake, not because it wouldn't work without that, but because he is directing us to these particular forms that are essential for us in the experience of them, right? Every one of our sacraments has a matter enough form, right? And the form has to be observed, right? So if you can God forgive sins without the form of confession? Yeah. Can our sins be forgiven that way without going to confession at all? With perfect contrition? Yes. Don't count on that. Could God forgive sins without perfect contrition outside of confession? Yeah, he could. Will he? We don't know. We know that he will within the sacrament. And that's the case with all of our liturgical acts. Again, like liturgy is where God intervenes directly in and transforms the world. It's where and how. We look for signs and miracles all the time outside of the liturgy, and we ignore the ones that happen all the time. Liturgy is how God directly acts in our world. And he has given us these forms for our liturgical acts. Not because they're needed for him, but because they're needed for us. And so that is how those things occur. And so we observe the forms and should continue to observe the forms. Can you have a relationship with God outside of that? Absolutely. But that is how God has guaranteed that he will consistently and always act upon our world. And so if you're trying to build a relationship with God, you're trying to find his presence and his action in the world, you really should be doing the things that he told us to do in the way that he told us to do them to make that happen. Imagine you had like a friend you're trying to build a relationship with who tells you like, hey, you could come over and hang out with me at my house on Wednesday nights and we could like play a game or something, and says, this is how we should spend time, right? You just show up and we hang out on Wednesday nights. And you try to cultivate a friendship with the person and you decide, yeah, okay, I'm going to go over on Tuesday mornings. And that's going to cultivate that relationship, right? The person invited you within one context into a relationship, and you said, that's not how I want that. I want it on my terms and this other way, and I'm going to try to have a relationship with you that way, right? Like, it doesn't work, right? Or you're not going to get if you're dealing with someone very patient, you might be able to make a little bit of progress, but you definitely will be off on the wrong foot and won't make the level of progress you'd make if you met the person where they're at and under their terms. Relationship with God is no different. God says, this is how I want you to have a relationship with me. Does it mean you can't have a relationship with God in other ways? No. But if you want to if your goal is to have the best relationship with God that you can, why wouldn't you do it in the way he told you he wants you to do it? It's the best way to approach that. And it's the only sure way to approach that. So observing the form is a useful thing for us to do. There is one other important element here, which is because this is the first time God's not just doing it for the people, right? Like, since they made it out of Egypt, it was, I'm just going to kill the Egyptians for you. I'm just going to make there be water. I'm just going to have food fall out of the sky. I'm just going to have Moses hit a rock and there's water. Like, these people haven't had to do anything. This is the first instance where they do have to. And so we start to see the importance of, there are quite a few layers of relational importance here, right? set up literally with a hill to help make the layers and levels important, right? The least important part of what's happening is Joshua and the army fighting. The most important part is Moses with his hands raised. Joshua can't do it by himself. Moses, as it turns out, even being the most significant part of the victory, can't do it himself because his arms are too, I mean, he's not a young man at this point. His arms get too tired. So if he could stick around and do that, if he had the strength, he could have won the victory himself. He's a type of Christ, where Moses falls just a little short in his mortality. Jesus does not. Moses needs help. And so Moses' arms are propped up to see that happens. The typology there is that Moses himself is not sufficient, whereas Christ is, right? Moses is still a flawed human mortal guy, and Jesus is God, and can do what Moses is doing just a little better than Moses, which is no slight to Moses, right? Like Moses is the best, like pure human, non-God person to ever do what Moses does, and nobody else could come close. The fact that Moses could be in a conversation where you're comparing what he does with something that Jesus could do, and they get this close. Like all the time, he gets this close to where Jesus was, and he's just Moses, is incredible. Like Moses is a remarkable figure, but he is still a flawed human person, and can't quite get it done. But he can be helped. And within our own liturgies are not reliant upon the perfection of the priest involved, because Jesus makes up what's lacking and helps in a way much greater than what Jesus, the one who can do it himself, can also allow Father, whoever your priest is, to make up for being too weak to continue to do it as well, right? It's built into our liturgy that our ministers are like Moses, need help. Whereas Moses got help from Aaron and Hur, our priests get help from Jesus, who takes a role in propping up their weaknesses and allowing them to carry out the rites that are at hand. The sacraments work regardless of the holiness of the priest. We want holier priests, but they work even if the priest is flawed and failing, and we've had some that are pretty icky. And even so, the sacraments work because Jesus is there propping up the arms of that priest and allowing and kind of overshadowing that act. And God is the one actually winning the victory, right? So it can work regardless. But Moses demonstrating the need for, at times, for some assistance. Since this is the first conflict of the people of Israel with someone else, it seems God is holding a bit of a grudge. And here, God in the Old Testament gets a reputation for being a bit on the vengeful side, and not undeservedly so. And this is an example of that. Amalek and his people stood in the way of God and his people. God and his people triumphed, and God said, yeah, that's not enough. We're going to totally obliterate them later. That's not how we're used to thinking about God. But it's important that you look at Amalek here as not a guy, and instead as an obstacle in the pathway of God's people. One that is gotten around for now, but one that ultimately needs to be totally obliterated. I think in that, I know that's a hard shift to make because we know it's a person and a people. And, how could God show preference for his people over other people? Well, he does. That's the Old Testament. He's in the Old Testament. He has selected this people as his people, and they're the ones that he cares about and that he has a relationship with. Now, they're meant to be the acts as and this is why the comparison with Moses is so important, right? Because Moses is the intermediary between God and these people, right? And Moses is a very holy man and does a good job. So he enables these people. They don't live up to it, but he, for his part, creates the mediation that could allow for these people to have a relationship with God. They are meant to be, as Moses is to them, to all of the people, right? God does want to bring everybody in line. He wants to do it through this people that he has chosen. And insofar as they fail to live up to their relationship with God constantly, the other people don't have a chance. And that's kind of what happens until it doesn't, until Jesus, who makes sure everybody understands it was always God's intention that everybody come into line, and that everybody be invited and have a share. And Jesus opens the doors to everyone in a way that salvation still comes from the Jews, insofar as Jesus is a Jew, but you don't have to go through you don't have to go that way anymore. And there's a new pathway to get to a relationship with God now, through Jesus. But before it was still intended that if the people were holy and good servants of God, that everyone else would see that and come to God. While that's not happening, God has to do what he can to protect his people. And that involves things like wiping out Amalek and his people from the face of the earth. And while we don't see a lot of that in Exodus, it sure comes up when the people get into the Holy Land. And for all of the duration of the time that the people are in the Holy Land. From then until today, as it turns out. But God's intention was for them to be a blessing to all nations. And their possession of the Holy Land to likewise be a thing that was brought about peace and blessing to all nations and not so much with the conflict. But it has been what it has been. And Jesus Christ brought the ultimate fulfillment of that brings a pathway to salvation to all people. This has been an overview of Lesson 14 of the Turning to God's Word Bible Study. You shall have no other gods, the book of Exodus. For more information, consult our written study and visit us online at turningtogodsword.com.